and I can be in control of my mental health or control to some extent. I have a tool. There's all of these studies now to try to understand why exercises in sports, running seems to be the thing that is like really powerful as an antidepressant. Like any form of exercise is good for you, but running in particular seems to be good. And one super interesting theory that I read recently is that because it is such a high stress sport, because it's or so high impact, I guess is the term, on your knees and all your joints, every time your foot hits the ground, your body thinks it's being injured. So it releases whatever chemical your body uses to sort of like heal the pain or just like deal with absorbing the pain, even though you're not actually being injured. I'm sure I'm butchering this, but it was like, it made sense to me. I was like, okay, right. Like your body thinks it needs to like heal you or blunt some pain. And so it's like releasing this happy energy.
This is the Changeup. I'm Keith Hernandez, and this week we welcome Claire Mazur, co-founder of A Kind and co-author of Workwife. We learn what it feels like to start your own business, sell it, walk away, and then start something new. We also dig into the dynamics that make a powerful business partnership that lasts. And finally, I get a lesson in the art of the Amazon brushing scam. Awesome. Claire, great to have you here. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. Such a good excuse to talk to you.
Yeah, that's really the reason I'm doing this podcast, right? Is people that I love that I don't get to see because of the pandemic. It forces us all to get in front of a camera, in front of a microphone and chat. So thank you for doing it.
So everybody does a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So you've been doing one for a while, right? It's been what, 6 years since you started?
Yes. Since 2015. Exactly. Yeah. A little over 6 years.
Okay, cool. What have you learned in those 6 years?
Wow. I wish I could say that I've learned something about podcasting. Okay, what have I learned? The biggest thing I've learned is just watching an industry change, because it has changed so much since I've started it, specifically around the ad revenue and the ad model and how people are thinking about buying ads with podcasts. I think that's been a fascinating learning. I think I've also learned that consistency is such a big part of it.
Yeah.
And that goes for like all content, but also life in general. Just, showing up regularly is sometimes half the battle.
Yeah.
And I think my initial reaction to being like, I haven't actually learned anything is just because I do think, for me anyway, the podcast is so much just like showing up, doing it, and then I immediately forget everything I said. And then friends will text and be like, oh my God, I love that thing. And they'll deliver no context. And I'm like, I have no clue what you're talking about. And they're like, on the podcast this week, you said that thing. And I'm like, oh, right. So I don't know that I've like learned things in that way. But yeah, I mean, I love podcasting as a format in general. I think it's been a lot of fun.
So you do the podcast with Erica, who you've called your work wife, not only in person, but you published a book together.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about your relationship with Erica, what you have created over the past decade together, because it's a lot.
So much. So Eric and I actually met in 2002, my freshman year in college. We both went to the University of Chicago for undergrad, and we're really good friends all throughout college. And then both moved to New York after graduation, and in 2010 had this idea for a company called Of a Kind. And the premise was that we would sell pieces, limited edition pieces from emerging fashion designers, and tell the backstory of the pieces and the designers who made them. And at the time, people weren't really combining content and commerce. And so it felt really, it was really sort of new and fresh, this idea that we were going to put just as much effort and energy on this website into selling as we were into storytelling. And it was also sort of the height, I don't want to call it the height of fast fashion, because it feels like fast fashion's been at its height for a while, but it was really, fast fashion was really hitting its stride. And this idea of small makers and limited edition pieces was really novel. And we launched that company in 2010 and grew it for 9 years. And over the course of the 9 years expanded into beyond just fashion. We did home and beauty and like all lifestyle. And out of that company grew a lot of things. The podcast, this newsletter that we continue to do now, all sorts of things that were effectively sort of content marketing, but were just things that interested us and that we were excited about at the time. And so we can get more into this later if you want, but we sold the company in 2015 to Bed Bath & Beyond, shut it down at the end of 2019. And that same year in 2019, we published a book called Workwife about the power of female friendship to drive successful businesses. And it was based on our story, but also the stories of 13 other duos and trios of work wives, these women who were friends and had started or led businesses together. And really it explored like what it is about female friendship that in an office or in a business environment leads to better business results, and how you're starting to see business norms change because women bring themselves to the office in that way, whether it's like about transparency or collaboration and creativity and very basic things like, the way women tend to share really easily with one another. And so what it can mean for a business environment if the people that you're working with understand what sort of wins, losses, trials, tribulations you're dealing with at home and how that impacts work. So that was our book, Work Wife.
And I want to mention, you said it was amazing case studies with the other people that you talked to.
Hmm.
Everyone should read it, right? Not just
Yeah,
women, because
right, right.
I,
Yeah,
I
definitely.
I picked it up at a pretty critical juncture where me and my business partner were just starting out, also just trying to figure out our working dynamic and our working relationship. And I think I read it in like 2 nights, and both nights stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning. And Abby was like, "Are you still reading that book?" And I was, and then when I finished it, she was like, "You finished that so fast." And I was like, every single chapter had an application for what I was dealing with at that time. So it, for anybody starting a business, especially and was looking for a founder or figuring out who their founder should be, it's super crucial.
Keith, that means so much. You've told me that a long time ago, but I kind of forgotten. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that it helped you.
Yeah, and it's something that I've told other people to read as well when they're venturing out and thinking about what to do. Because I think a lot of people get this advice: find a technical partner,
Hmm.
find this, right? And it's this thing where yours is way more nuanced about,
Hmm.
I think, the human behavior and psychology that goes into a partnership versus the technical skills that go into partnership.
Well, especially if you're founding a business together, it's truly a marriage. And if your personalities don't work, if you're not taking the time to think about the relationship in addition to and alongside the business, it's just not going to work. And I do think, culturally we've gotten to a place where with romantic relationships we all sort of acknowledge like it takes time and work, and it's not always fun, and you have to talk about things you don't want to talk about. But the same is true of partnerships at work. And it was just really interesting to see how different women had been approaching this. And I think we were coming from a place of women seem sort of more likely to naturally have some of these conversations and do these things. But to your point, it's not exclusive to women, and it certainly shouldn't be.
Yeah. So when you were starting the company, were you working a full-time job before? Or was it something that you wanted to get out of the corporate world and into your own business?
Yeah, I was working at the time in arts management. So I'd been in a bunch of different roles in arts administration, and at the time was working actually for a national organization of theaters, of professional theaters. And I was looking at the time for my next job and struggling to figure out what it was. And this is like tangential, but I had sort of lost faith in the nonprofit structure as like a way of supporting arts and artists. And so was really interested at the time in for-profit companies that were starting to crop up to support artists and creative projects. So Kickstarter was one, and another one was 20 by 200. Still exists. This company run by Jen Beckman, who is a curator, and they sell limited edition art prints. And again, this was something that at the time was like really new and revolutionary, and to me signaled a lot of potential change for how the visual art world worked. And so I was really interested in working for her, and had been sending Erica was like my friend who I would send cover letters to be like, can you read this and just make sure it sounds good? And I sent her my cover letter for a job at 20 by 200. And then after, I think did that while I was at my day job. And then on the subway ride home, started to think about, like, is this could this model exist? Could this 20 by 200 model exist in other markets, basically? And then got home, emailed Erica, read this instead of my cover letter. And that was the seed of the idea for Of a Kind. We were both really excited about it. So we did both eventually leave our jobs. And Erica was a full-time magazine editor at that point and had been for 5 years, I think.
She stayed on a little bit longer though, correct?
Yeah, a little bit longer. Yeah, we quit. We both quit around the same time, in part because we were having those hard conversations around like what is actually realistic here, and like we need to sign a partnership agreement, and what does that look like, and all of that stuff. But she also, had, I think, more of a vision of a career trajectory at that point than I did. I had
Right.
felt pretty disenchanted with where I was and really didn't know what my dream job was. Whereas she at some point had had a dream of being like the editor-in-chief of a magazine, and I think by the time we had the idea for Of a Kind came around, was starting to realize that she didn't know what that job would look like by the time she might get there. So, I think it was a little bit more of a leap for her to sort of abandon the plan she had, whereas I was just like, wow, this seems so much more appealing than what I'm doing now. And, we were young, we were in our 20s, so we didn't have a lot to lose. And it's not to like take anything away from us, but when people are like, you were so brave to do that, I acknowledge it was brave in a lot of ways. It didn't feel brave at the time because it was like, what do I have to lose? You know?
Yeah. So I love that you brought up the partnership stuff because that was some of the most interesting content when I was reading your book. Talk to me a little bit about that and the importance of kind of doing that. Again, me and my business partner, he had started a company before, so he knew the value of it
Hmm.
and was like, I think we need to do this and work through it. I had never done something like that. Talk about the emotional conversations you had to have, but also the
Yeah.
intellectual conversations you had to have to kind of get that operating agreement on paper.
I mean, so by the time we'd gotten to the operating agreement, we'd both committed in pretty big ways. I think it was we agreed that 2 nights a week we would meet up after work and like work on a business plan and work on a marketing plan and do all of this stuff. So we had already gotten out of the way that we were both committed to this, that we were both on the same page about the creative vision and what we wanted this to be. And, that we could and liked working together, which is something we also knew because we had worked together on a bunch of extracurriculars in college. But it was sort of nice to have had those months where we were like, okay, like we're both serious about this. So it wasn't as if like the partnership agreement was the very first thing we did. And I don't think that would have made sense. But by the time we got to the partnership agreement, it was, what does the equity breakdown here look like? And who's the CEO? And what does this look like long term? And who gets veto power and who gets final say over what things? And it was super painful. And I think I knew at the time even, and I was right about this, that it was like ideally one of the hardest processes that she and I would go through with each other, and that it was also really necessary, and that it would be the type of thing where like if we could get through that, we could get through pretty much anything else, because it's truly challenging to be like, well, I think I bring more to the table than you, or vice versa, or or I'm only comfortable if I have final say over XYZ. And you're bearing a lot of like egos and insecurities, and also we were young, and also you have people in your ear, whether it's your parents or lawyers or friends, who are like, do you really want to do this? And don't you think you should have this? And don't you think she should have that? And I think it taught me a lot about, about just like the importance of having those hard conversations and being able to come out the other side and not hold it against one another, that you're just like, okay, we've done that and now we're going to move forward and we're never going to think about it again. And honestly, like we kind of didn't until we had to. And there were some important points where we had to, but it was like once it was done and we moved on. But I was glad to have done it. The other thing I will say about it is that one of the things we talk about in the book that I think is really important is this idea that Eric and I tend to, whenever we're approaching a new type of project or work in our business that we've never done before. So whether it's like figuring out how to launch a podcast or approaching like a new legal process that we've never had to deal with before, our habit tends to be that we will do it together. Like we will both be on the calls, we will both be super involved in all of the details. And then at some point, we don't both need to be involved because we both like, we've got a handle on it. We've agreed on what it looks like and how it should be approached. And so let's say like I'm handling all of the ads for our podcast or something. If in the beginning we were doing it as a twosome and she was privy to everything, then A, we've both agreed on what that process looks like. And B, if I ever need her advice or help with something, she has enough insight into how it works that she can help with that and she can come at it from an informed position. In those early days when we were starting the company, I was the only one really interacting with the lawyer around incorporation documents. And when I look back on that, like I think that that was bad for that very reason, that
Right.
like I had the lawyer in my ear, I had the insights around like what exactly is equity and what does a vesting schedule look like. And I think in retrospect, she should have been in every single one of those meetings and on every single one of those phone calls. It was just, the early days, we both had jobs. It was like, okay, I'll do this and you meet with the accountants. And that's one of those things where I think if we'd been like more of a united front on that, then the conversations that followed wouldn't have been as challenging.
That's great insight. And when you were creating those documents, was it just your guys' thought that it would be you two? Or was there already the intention to grow the team a little bit as you were creating those documents?
It's funny. So we had a lawyer in the beginning of a Kind, a big like white shoe law firm that represented all of the big VC backed startups. And this was because we needed a lawyer, and my mom, who was in biotech, knew a lot of lawyers who dealt in VC because biotech startups are all VC backed, and so she somehow found this person for me. And I think just by virtue of having that lawyer, we did a lot of things as if we were a startup, even though we thought of ourselves as a small business. And one of those things was the lawyer saying, well, you need to think about this in a way where you're A, leaving a little bit of equity for employees and advisors, and B, structuring this in a way that it will make it easy for you to fundraise eventually and to raise an equity round. So, I mean, at that time, we were like, of course we're going to fundraise. Of course we're going to do this. It was 2010. Like, Foursquare was just like hitting its stride. Rent the Runway was getting really big. Kickstarter was getting really big. So it was this moment of like New York having its big startup boom. And again, like I couldn't have articulated this at the time. We really thought of ourselves as a small business, but we also were like, of course, we're going to meet with investors and that's how we'll raise money for this business.
Right.
We did at the time also go to in person to the Small Business Administration of New York City, and we were like, so how do we get a loan? And they were like, what are you talking about? It was 2010. Like we were still, just getting past the recession. So it just felt like the way. And so, yes, to a long-winded way of answering your question, we assumed that other people would have equity in the company. And
So you carved out like the 20-25%
mhm,
for, okay, cool.
something like that.
Yeah.
I truly cannot remember exactly what it looked like, but I know that we were like fully ready to, just raise millions of dollars from Sequoia or whatever, we're like, of course we will.
How big did the company get in terms of employees?
Before we were acquired by Bed Bath, the largest we had ever been was 5 total, including myself and Erica. So it was
Okay.
2 of us and 3 employees. And then while we were at Bed Bath, we grew to 10 total. And of course, that doesn't include like all of the freelancers and
Right.
contractors and everything, but that was full time.
Okay. How did the dynamic change when it went from you and Erica, the work
Mhm.
wife team, to now 3 other full-time employees in the office and the dynamics that went with that?
It's so funny because I genuinely have so much love for everyone who's ever worked for us. Like, and I'm not just saying that because maybe they'd hear this or something, but we were really good about hiring, and I still to this day I think talk to every single person who's ever worked at Of a Kind and have so much affection for all of them. And yet I also really don't ever want employees ever again. And I'll probably have them again, or I should be so lucky
So why is that?
because I think 2 things, like, you asked about me and Erica, and I think it was hard from that vantage point, and I think we figured it out and we got into a flow, but it was certainly hard in the same way it's hard for, like, a couple when you have a baby and you're like, "It's not just us anymore, and now we have to figure out how to navigate with this 3rd force in the room." But I think it's also because I cared so much. I really cared what they thought about me. I cared if they thought I was doing a good job. I cared if they were happy. I cared about everything, and I cared so much about the business too, so I, like, desperately didn't wanna be a micromanager, but had a hard time not being because I felt and I think knew to some extent that, like, the attention to detail and the hyper focus on everything was part of what was making the business a success, and so I just found it to be a challenging dynamic, and it really weighed heavily on me, and I didn't realize how much it weighed on me until we shut down Of a Kind. And I just felt such a sense of relief around not being responsible for someone's emotions and paycheck. And I felt deeply responsible for both of those things.
So talk a little bit about that day you found out that you're shutting down, and it sounds like a little bit of relief, but it also probably was a little bit of hurt, right?
Oh my gosh, it was so sad. But I think in a lot of ways I had processed a lot of the grief beforehand because Bed Bath& and Beyond had been going through a really big transition all year. So I think they told us in September or October
Okay.
that it was being shut down. And because it is a public company, a lot of their dirty laundry is in the newspaper. And so the dirty laundry at that time was that they had activist investors who wanted to push out the board and the CEO. And so for months, we had been having conversations at our team meetings because our employees were asking us, like, okay, I saw this thing in the news. What's happening? Are we going to lose our jobs?
Yeah.
And so it was public conversation of like, we don't know what this means for us. And eventually the activist investors were successful in pushing out the board and the CEO. And we knew that at that point all bets were off, that we had been acquired by, the CEO and the head of marketing and the head of biz dev who had been there for a really long time. And all those people were gone by the time they shut down Of a Kind and shut down a number of other companies. And so I think we walked into that meeting pretty sure we knew what was happening.
Which is better than being blindsided.
Totally better than being blindsided. I will say, like, I look back at my journal from that year and, like, every entry is with, like, "I'm so worried about our jobs," or "I'm, like, anxious about our jobs." I was really glad to have been able to have those open conversations with our employees leading up to it, which was, like, this weird silver lining of it being a public company where if it weren't, they wouldn't have known, and even if I had had insight into it, it would have been so terrible to be like, "Surprise, you had no idea this was coming." But again, because this was in the news, there was some preparation for it. And it was really sad. And it was also one of these things where, we felt like we could kind of see what the new direction of the company was going to be. And we felt like we had a lot to offer. And they made the decision to shut down Of a Kind under an interim CEO. And then when they found their future CEO, it was someone who had been at Target for a really long time. And we were like, wow, like we get this. I mean,
Yeah.
before we joined Bed Bath, we'd actually done a big national partnership with Target,
Oh, wow. Okay.
which was like part of the starting point for our conversation with Bye Bye Baby, where we were like, maybe they'd want to talk to us because we could do something similar for them. What we did for Target, we'd been in 350 stores with these like Of a Kind kiosks. So it was a little like heartbreaking in that way of like, man, if we could have just held on for a little longer, like I think we
Yeah.
could have really connected with this new leadership. But at the same time, we had been doing this thing. We'd been working on it for 10 years at that point. And in retrospect, so I think our last day in business was November 1st, 2019. And, we all know what happened next. And I was so grateful that it happened when it did, because it meant we got to sort of like put it to rest properly, like
Yeah.
give it its due. We got to like, we had a, a party, like
Yeah.
and said goodbye. And
Which is important. That
yeah,
closure for everybody is
yeah,
important.
exactly, exactly. And then, and I think it would have been had we kept going and had we had to face COVID, worst case scenario, we would have shut down under COVID and had to have that really traumatic experience, but do it all over Zoom. And like best case scenario, I cannot imagine having tried to run that company remotely, like over Zoom. I mean, we were dealing with physical products
Yeah.
and not as though we were shipping them, but there were samples coming in every day. And it just, I did feel grateful at that moment not to be running it. Not that it wasn't scary and hard in other ways, because we were just about to start like these new careers, and it was like, and now there's a pandemic.
Yeah. So you did end up starting this kind of new career during the pandemic. And I
Yeah.
think we met maybe a month or two before that when you guys were
Yes.
getting going on this. So
Yeah.
talk to me about how you and Erica got the newsletter, built up the
Yeah.
podcast, built up the consulting business through this whole pandemic. through
Yeah. So I mentioned we had started the podcast and the newsletter when we were Of a Kind. And the concept of both of them is really just like lifestyle and discovery driven, very much like same spirit as Of a Kind, where it's just like us sharing the stuff we love with a heavy emphasis on shopping, but like also just lifestyle and friendship and relationships. And so we knew that when Of a Kind shut down that we wanted to continue doing it. And we did to some extent have to start from scratch again
Yeah.
with things like the newsletter list. But we had an audience and we had a following, and we renamed both the podcast and the newsletter, but the sort of like brand ethos remained. And so there was that sort of reputation, and relaunched both the newsletter and the podcast. And we also decided we wanted to consult for a while. We thought about like, is there another business we want to start? And there wasn't, especially because every time we would think of a new business we wanted to start, it was retail. And we both felt like we really needed a break from
Yeah.
retail. It's especially now. And so we were like, all right, like let's consult for a while. And timing wise, so our last days were November 1st, and we were like, well, we need to give ourselves a break because no one will ever give it to
For
us.
sure.
And so let's like plan on starting like up in earnest, around like February, March of
Yeah.
2020,
Perfect.
which
Perfect
was,
timing.
yeah, perfect timing. But we, sort of like put out the word, like we're available to consult. And like it was a slower start than we would have liked, but it was immediately gratifying in the ways that I hoped it would be, which is that after 10 years of working on one thing that I'm so close to and have absolutely no perspective on, to work on many things at once where I have some distance from them and like to worry about other people's problems has just been so refreshing. And I'm sure at some point, client services will start to be exhausting and painful in its own ways. But for now, I really like it. I really like working on other people's problems.
That's great to hear. Yeah. And the service business, it's funny because my business is also a service business. And
Hmm.
some investors have said, well, you can't really scale that. And my answer to
Hmm.
that is I don't want to. I
Yeah.
like the 3 to 5 problems
Yeah. Hmm.
that I
I
know about
agree. Yeah.
versus the 3 to 5
Yeah.
thousand that could be brought on there.
Yeah.
Before starting the consulting company, again, the newsletter
Hmm.
and the podcast you've been doing for many
Hmm.
years, we've been there's this flutter on Twitter about the content creator market. And the reality is people
Mm.
have been creating content for decades, maybe even centuries.
Yeah.
Your company, especially of a kind, you always had this model of creating original content around the
Hmm.
brand and building a brand personality for yourself. Can you talk about the
Hmm.
importance of kind of building Claire and Erica along with of a kind and how that helped the business?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mentioned Erica came from magazines, and so she had a strong sort of like editorial perspective and approach, and has always taken a sort of very sort of like, I don't want to call it formal, but a structured approach to like, here's how we do storytelling, here's what our voice is, and here's how we think about this. And I think that's been really helpful. But it also, it was in some ways that there were certain aspects of it that were really intentional in that way. There were other parts of it that were not intentional. It was just that we were the only two employees, and so we signed every email, Claire and Erica, because we were the ones writing it. And we modeled all of our stuff in the beginning because we did not have money for models, and like it was just like, of course we will be the ones modeling it. So it very quickly became like a part of the business, this idea of Claire and Erica. And one thing that we would always say is like, the voice that we use to write about Of a Kind and to write to our customers is the same voice that we use to write emails to each other, and that we would use to G-chat each other all day when we were at our jobs. And that just felt really natural to us. And then it became, as you said, this sort of like Claire and Erica brand that was built up alongside the business. And I think for all 9 years of that business, struggled with exactly how those two things interplayed. And certainly, like, it was clear that they benefited from each other, but we were never super comfortable with going full on girl boss and like doing the sort
Right.
of Sophia Amoroso route. And I'm glad we didn't. And yet, even now, we still struggle with it a little bit. I mean, the podcast and the newsletter are so much fun, and we both love them so much. And yet, there's a certain amount of relief to me that they're not my only income.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that because, of course, I want them to grow, as like you want any business to grow, and you want more of an audience for any sort of creative pursuits you're doing. And yet I recognize that there's a certain amount of pressure that comes with that growth. And I don't want to always have to have something to say. I don't like always want to also have to answer for stupid stuff I said. And so the idea of like growing the Claire and Erica brand, I think, has been what has naturally come out of our personalities and our approach to business. But it's never been like, let's sit down and vision board how we get to Oprah status, you know?
Right. Yeah. Is there a difference now where, because you have done brand
Hmm.
sponsorships or have kind
Mm-hmm.
of put things on Instagram
Yeah.
or some of your other handles from companies sending you products, does it change your relationship from where you were a buyer before and
Yeah.
now you are, helping them sell?
Yeah, that part I actually really like. So we sold ads at Of a Kind, both in the newsletter and the podcast, but it was never a big business. And now obviously it's a much bigger part of our business. And the thing that I is really fun about it is we no longer have to worry about anything being competitive with Of a Kind, because there was always this like a challenge in being a retailer who was also selling ads, because you'd be like, I don't know if we can promote this thing or that thing or whatever. And it's really fun now to just be able to be really intentional, and about which advertisers we link up with, and to really be able to say like, I actually tried this thing and I like this thing. I mean, we turn away advertisers if it's like, that seems like snake oil, or that's not something we'd actually use. But same goes for brands that aren't advertising with us, where like, I'll share stuff on Instagram that somebody sent me because I think it's interesting, and because I think our audience tends to be interested and just look to us to give them a survey of what's on the market. It really is like discovery oriented. And so I think our listener tends to be the person who's like, I want to know what all the hot CBD brands are. Like, I don't want to just know the one, I want to know them all. So
Yeah.
I like to post that stuff, and I like that there doesn't feel as much weirdness around it as there did when I was also had like clothes and jewelry and other stuff to sell, to also be like, but also this other brand.
Yeah. That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Are you just getting ridiculous stuff sent to your house all the time?
There was like a turning point in the pandemic where, yeah, it started because people don't know where else to spend their marketing budgets.
Right. So they're
And
like, send it to Claire.
or just like to everybody. And this is like another funny thing too, where as part of this like tension that I just described, I fully never considered myself like a professional influencer, and I don't feel obligated to post everything that somebody sends me, or like I try not to like do things because it's like what a blogger would do or something like that. And
Right.
yet, especially this past year, if businesses are sending me something, I'm like, they need the help. I really want to share this stuff. And so, like, I do try to share what I think is relevant, but the businesses have started sending a lot of really insane stuff because, like, money that would go into a fancy event or an activation or whatever is is now just going into custom gift boxes, which is nice. And I like it. And I discover a lot of stuff that way. And I also give a lot of stuff away to friends and family. And the funniest part of all of this is that I got a box at some point that was full of really, really random, weird stuff. It was before the whole like water bottle craze that is happening right now, but it was one of those water bottles that would like encourage you to drink a certain amount of water. And then it was like a weird radio flashlight thing. And I was like, who sent me this? Like, did a podcast listener send me this and thought that I should like put this on the podcast, or like did a brand send me this? I was sure that it had been intentionally sent to me, and it had been intentionally sent to me, but lo and behold, it was something called a brushing scam where
Oh,
Amazon sellers send their product to random people so that they can then become verified customers so that then they can write a review for the products.
wait, what?
It's a little complicated, but basically start with the premise that reviews on Amazon are everything, right?
Right. Yeah.
So how do you get more reviews for your product if you have to have purchased the product in order to write a review? You just start sending it out to random people and then you write the review.
Oh, wow.
So people get your address and they just send you stuff so that they can then write the review on their behalf. But I thought I was like getting sent this gift, and I thought it was the most random gift. But then I started getting more and more of this random stuff from Amazon and eventually figured out what was going on. It was
Okay.
really bizarre.
Has that spigot been
That
shut
I
off or?
that did get shut off,
Okay.
unfortunately, or fortunately. We had to throw a lot of that stuff away. It was like men's G-strings started coming. It was really weird.
The influencer stuff now incorporate your family anyway? You have a wonderful child,
Mm.
and he's dressed pretty freshly most of the time I've seen him.
He is, although he has not been made part of, like, I've not sold any ads or Instagram posts or anything that are sort of predicated upon him. I mean,
Okay.
I'm trying to think if there's, and I don't know that I'd feel comfortable with that. I like sharing him because I really like, I mean,
Him.
he's
He's
cute. I
awesome.
like him. I also just really have a fun time dressing him. I was like, when I found out I was having a boy, I thought it was going to be way less fun to dress him, but it's been really fun. And so, but I also if you can believe it, I actually like do exercise some amount of restraint, because I do have some like, conflicting feelings about it, both for myself because I don't want to just be seen as a mom. And
Yeah.
so I worry that if like everything I post is my kid, it's just like, then that becomes my entire identity. But also for his sake, he might not want to be posted constantly. And
Yeah.
one day he'll have something to say about it.
Yeah, right now he doesn't know what's going on, but he will
Exactly.
eventually. Something you and I share, a hobby that I wish I did more of, is running.
Hmm.
Can you talk about how
Hmm.
important running has been to you throughout your career?
Oh my gosh, so important. I don't think anything about my life would look like it looks if I didn't run, if I hadn't started running, which I started doing in 2008 as a way of getting off antidepressants that I had been
Oh,
on for
wow.
a really long time. So I had started antidepressants the summer after my freshman year in college and had just never gotten off of them. And like, I think in part because I had started seeing, like, I would just get different psychiatrists because you move after college. And so these people are
Right.
just like, at that point, they're just like, cool, it's my job to maintain your medication. And if they're still working, then they're still working. And I also think because, like, your therapist is usually separate from your prescribing psychiatrist, like,
Yeah.
which seems crazy to me. It's like, people were just like, if it's working, it's working. Like, we'll stick with it. And so like 6 or 7 years later, it was like, what am I still doing on these things? And like the like one of the major impetuses for it was what I would starting to get weird neurological side effects, like these like sort of vertigo and stuff.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
so I was like, all right, now's the time to get off this. And I truly wish I could tell you what gave me the idea that exercise would be the thing that would help me cycle off antidepressants. I knew I was like really scared of cycling off them because I didn't want to get depressed again. So I wanted to do it really gradually. And I was like, I'm just going to start running too. And that'll sort of replace the endorphins. And I know it seems crazy to be like, I don't know where I got this idea, because now in 2021, everybody knows that exercise is really good for your mental health. But in
Yeah.
2008, nobody was talking about that. Clearly somebody was, because it's not like I just made it up, but like somehow I got it in my head that I should exercise. And so I started at the same time I was cycling off antidepressants. I would go to the gym and get on the treadmill for like 10 minutes at a time every day. And I was just really consistent about it and worked my way up to 15 minutes. And anybody who has ever gotten started to run after not doing it for a while knows that 10 minutes is like truly painful, especially on a treadmill.
Yep.
Like it's just
Yeah.
so hard
That's
and so
exactly
long.
how I started too. Was
Yeah.
was just do 10 minutes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that 10 minutes is so hard. It's like they always say, like, there's a minute in real life and there's a minute in treadmill life, and it's like it's very very different minutes. And it worked, and I, like, immediately was like, "Wow, this actually works for me. It really helps with my anxiety," and I was just lived in constant fear of being depressed or anxious, which I think is, like, a common thing for people who deal with depression and anxiety. Like, when you're good, except for the fact that you're so scared of feeling bad again. So I was really just, like, hyper focused on being consistent about it and never missing a day, and now it's been however many years later, and I still do it. And now, I've incorporated other forms of exercise, but running is still my primary form. And I think the thing that's like most helpful for me, for my mental health, and it's just the one thing that I've always been really good about making time for and making clear to everybody in my life that it's a priority, whether it's like, when we started Of a Kind, I was like, I run in the morning, so we can't start until 10 a.m. And when I, had CAM, I was really focused on making sure that this was this one thing that I could still do. And I think, there's the physical and psychological benefits, but I also think, as someone who had never been athletic in my life and was not particularly good about habits in general, picking up this thing taught me that like I can do hard things that I think I can't do. I can form new habits late in life. I mean, it felt late in life to me at that point. I was like 26 or something, but it was like, wow, like I can do things that seem like not the type of things I would do. And that's just given me so much. It's made me be like, there's other habits I could form or drop if I needed to. And there's other hard things I can do. And I can like, yeah, and I can be in control of my mental health, which is probably the most important, or, control to some extent. I
Yeah.
have a tool. I read this thing. There's all of these studies now to try to understand why running is, of all of the like exercises in sports, running seems to be the thing that is like really powerful as an antidepressant. Like any form of
Yeah.
exercise is good for you, but running in particular seems to be good. And one super interesting theory that I read recently is that because it is such a high stress sport, because it's, or so high impact, I guess is the term,
On your knees
on
and
your knees and all your joints, every time your foot hits the ground, your body thinks it's being injured. So
oh,
it releases the
interesting.
endorphin, it releases whatever chemical your body it uses to sort of like heal the pain, or just like deal with absorbing the pain, even though you're not actually being injured. I'm sure I'm butchering this, but it was like it made sense to me. I was like, okay, right. Like your body thinks it needs to like heal you or blunt some pain. And so it's like releasing this happy energy.
I, I love that insight. I kind of
Yeah.
agree with it. Are you running every day or near every day?
I do run, yeah, pretty well, like 5 to 6 days a week. Yeah. Although
Wow.
I got a Peloton in the spring, and that became, I was like having a serious affair with that for a while, but now I'm back to a more balanced life.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Sidebar, let's talk about the Ali Love wedding because
Oh my God.
Chris knows I was a big Ali Love fan
I
before she
I
became
think
the
about you all the
Peloton
time. I know that because I think you and I like I yeah, Chris went to a Knicks game with you, or
a
a
Nets.
Nets
Yeah.
game with you. Right, right. And I and then he and I went to a Nets game, and he pointed her out and he was like, "Yeah, Keith really is like likes Ally Love." And then yeah, and then
And now she's this Peloton mega influencer. I always was like, she's got good energy. I was like, she's gonna go far. I
right.
I see it. And Chris turned that into me loving her. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Now she's making other influencers wear different dresses every single
I
day of her
mean,
wedding. Amazing. I
truly.
want to go back. There's a little thread there that's kind of fun
Mhm.
on talking with Erica about I can't come in until 10 a.m.
Mm,
Because I'm going to run.
mhm.
Especially now, right? We're all
Yeah.
sitting at home, or
Mhm.
the lucky ones of us are still sitting at
Yes.
home and not going to
Hmm.
an office or not
Yeah.
going to work their job in physically in person. How important is it to set those boundaries for your partner, but also for the working dynamic, right? Like
Yeah.
we have this opportunity to rewrite how we work and the times that we work. Is that something that you were deliberate with, especially with the running, or is it something that you had to learn on the way?
I think we were really deliberate with it. I mean, we were also in our 20s and working for ourselves for the first time. So I think there was a combination of two sort of like opposing instincts. One, to give ourselves a lot of structure so that we weren't just like flailing. And that was really coming from Erica too, where like she knew that she really valued structure and wanted to have set schedules and have set hours and all of that because, how else are you going to like not just dissolve into a puddle of like overwhelm and whatever and lack of accountability. But also there was, I think, the instinct to like, if we're going to start our own company and deal with all of the headaches of working for yourself, we should also give ourselves like the things that we need. And we were working so hard. I mean, we
Yeah.
just like really, especially then, just ground ourselves to the bone, and we knew that. And so we were good, I think, about where we could, giving ourselves freedoms or just benefits of, of some kind. And now I look back on that start time and I'm like, that was so important. And that was like an ethos that we carried through all of a Kind, where it's just like, it gets back to the entire work wife sort of philosophy that I explained earlier. It was just like people have personal lives and they impact work, and like, and work impacts your personal life. It's a two-way street. And so like you have to make allowances for both. And if you can give people later start time so that they can work and they can work out in the morning, like why wouldn't you? It's good for everybody. And certainly, there were aspects of Erica's life that we sort of structured the work, our working style around too. And I look back on that now and I think that's something I'm really proud that we did. And although I don't know at the time if I would have identified it as like counter to standard, business practice or anything like that, it just was common sense.
Yeah, especially at that time, I think it
Hmm.
was, right? You might not
Yeah.
have noticed it, but
Yeah.
all the startups in New York and San Francisco were running 60, 70-hour weeks
Yeah.
and burning out, right? I think
Hmm.
we know mutuals who literally burned out because of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So it is important. Yeah, one thing we're doing is at least I take off Fridays as much as I can
Yeah. Yeah.
and just work as hard as I can Monday through Thursday and give myself that extra day for myself.
I'm super interested in what becomes of the work week because I think we've been doing something similar, not like every Friday, but somewhat every other Friday. And then sometimes it is every Friday. And it's just like Fridays tend to be a day where we like definitely don't have meetings, often take the
Yes.
afternoon off, like
Yeah.
kind of do what you can. And I think a lot of people have been doing it since we started working from home. And I would rather work really long hours and work after Cam goes to bed and, during Monday through Thursday and then take Friday off. And I suspect that we'll start to see a lot more of that.
I I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think more and more people are realizing. I think somebody put it, Saturday and Sunday are still family days. You do need that one
Hmm.
day or those few hours to yourself. All
Agreed.
right. So I'd be remiss not to ask before we leave what trends you're a trendsetter. You've seen things before. What are kind of two or three big trends that you're seeing, whether it's in digital marketing,
Mm.
advertising, fashion, retail, that other people should be up on?
Oh gosh. Great question. What am I seeing? I mean, in fashion and design in general, colors just making such a big comeback. And I mean, for so long it was the Airbnb aesthetic, like everything's white, everything's
Yeah.
super neutral. And now I think that like is starting to feel a bit dated, and also just in reaction to the pandemic and people needing joy and people being at home all the time, people are looking for bright colors. And I think the nice thing about it too, though, is that for everybody who did go hard at, a neutral palette, whether it's in their wardrobe or at home, it's so that makes it all the more easy to add bright color
Yeah.
because like you've got a blank canvas to work with. This has been a super interesting thing when it comes to podcast advertising. We've been having a lot of success with dedicated episodes.
Oh, cool.
So instead of people just buying an ad spot, people are buying full on episodes dedicated to their brand or their story or their founder or whatever it is. And we're obviously like even more selective about those than we are with the ad spots, and we're pretty selective about the ad spots, but like, we don't want to be doing a full episode that we don't think our audience is going to enjoy and that's not interesting to us. But the ones that we have done have just performed really well. Our audience has responded really well to them. They've turned out to be good episodes, and I just think it's really interesting as a model. I'm curious to see where it goes. It's definitely something that we've been getting a lot more interest in all of a sudden. So I'm curious to see how much more of that there is.
Cool. Awesome. Where can people find your newsletter and your podcast?
athingertwohq.com. You can sign up for our newsletter there. We do a free Monday newsletter every week that's 10 things that we discovered that we love. And then our podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts. It's also called A Thing or Two and also comes out on Mondays. And then we have a paid subscriber newsletter that comes out on Thursdays. And that's our secret menu.
Oh, very cool. One last question. What advice would you give to somebody who's starting to think about leaving the corporate world and jumping in and starting to do their own thing?
I think talk about it all the time because it
Yeah,
helps you. I think
that's a
just
good
like
point.
tell everybody because one, you never know who's going to have good advice or a great connection or just be able to help you. But two, like it helps you. Well, and because it holds you accountable, right? Because you've like told people. But I think talking about it with other people helps you feel out what your level of comfortability with it actually is and what you actually want this thing to be. Because it's one thing when it's inside your head and it's another thing when you have to describe it to somebody else. And it's like, are you embarrassed? Are you nervous? Are you shy? Or is it like energize you when you finish telling somebody what it is you want to do? I found that to be a really helpful part of the process in the early days.
Excellent advice. Claire Mazur, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Changeup, produced by Elena Weedland, with original music by Rodney Hazard. If you liked what you heard, we'd appreciate your support by liking, sharing, leaving a comment, and subscribing wherever you listen. Thanks once again. Until next time.